This is the Haulin Assets podcast, where we show you how to start and run your own trucking company. Ever wanted to go out on your own? Follow Chris as he goes through the highs and lows of running on his own authority. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Haulin Assets podcast, episode number 163, I think. This is part 2 of our discussion about FMCSA scores and regulations and your ISS score and how to dig yourself out of a hole if you got into one. So that's what we're talking about today. I'm Craig, your host. Over there, he's Chris, but we don't care because sitting next to him is Alex. Welcome back, Alex.
Thank you.
All right. Chris, you know I'm kidding, right?
I don't know that I know you're kidding.
I'm kidding that I
Sure
even saw you there. So just to remind everybody one more time, HaulinAssetsLLC.com for full show notes, MotorCarrierHQ.com for tools and tips and people who can help you out, and HaulinAssetsAcademy.com for the courses you can take to make the leap from employee driver to owner operator. Now then, let's get into it with all of that housekeeping out of the way. Alex, you were saying there was somebody you were working with who went through a whole audit inspection process and was kind of freaking out a little bit, right?
Yeah, so he hauls fireworks, which requires an additional hazmat safety permit, which,
Yeah.
I mean, good thing. But part of getting approved for that permit is completing a comprehensive compliance review. So in his case, he was going through this compliance review well before a new entrant audit. He'd been active maybe 2 weeks, had one run under his belt, and was contacted to do this safety audit where they want to look at everything under the sun to make sure he's dotting his I's, crossing his T's,
Sure.
to transport these fireworks safely. And I think anybody hears the word audit and immediately gets nervous about what they're going to find. But in this case, he was over-prepared, which is never a bad thing. And he actually had a really positive experience. He went through the online upload with all of his paperwork, and the reviewer came out just to see that he had everything, physical copies, all organized in his company records. I mean, they got to know each other pretty well, honestly, talking about a lot of their hobbies and had a lot in common. So he was very pleased to see that the auditor who came out was human and wasn't there to shut his company down, wasn't trying to find something wrong. He was there to help him, give him pointers, and show him a way forward and how he can continue to follow the regulations that the FMCSA has put forth.
So this is kind of a special situation with somebody hauling fireworks, and so the additional audit kind of makes sense there. Oh, it sounds like this is not necessarily normal for anybody who starts a trucking company. It's this guy's case was a little bit special, right? And the lesson I'm hearing is, look, just because you get a notification that somebody wants to do an audit doesn't mean you have to freak out.
Correct.
Right? Is that, am I
Yes.
taking the right lesson here?
Yes.
Okay. But that being said, if you do get that letter, okay, as you said, it never hurts to be over-prepared, right? You may not need to freak out, but you do need to take it seriously, right? And
Correct.
That's the whole point of this episode is how to take it seriously and how to get yourself out of a hole if you find yourself in one. Is that fair, Chris?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. And most of these auditors, in my experience, they're not out there to kind of get you, or they're not looking for a gotcha. They want to see that you're operating safely and that you're trying. And a lot of times they use it as an educational tool to help you be better. Now, if you're blatantly not doing well, or you're not doing any kind of record keeping and you're failing in a lot of areas, they're going to note that down. They're going to be honest with it. But that's where, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. If you're doing 80 to 90% of what you're supposed to, it's going to go a lot better than if you're only doing like 30 or 40 or 50% of what you're supposed to. So, how prepared you are is going to have a lot to do with it in your attitude.
Okay, so don't be like me and sass off the auditor.
Yeah, attitude is a big thing.
I'd be screwed, you guys. I would be. There's a reason that I'm behind the microphone and not the wheel. Okay. All right. So let's talk then about what you're going to do if you get a bad audit.
So let's
or
start,
do you want to back up
I think
even
that's
further
good.
than that?
Let's do that, but let's start with just the new entrant audit. So what happens if you fail a new entrant audit?
Ooh.
So if you fail a new entrant audit, it's important to know that there's not just one thing that will fail you for an audit. There's a list of automatic failure violations, and you have to be in violation of one of those to be issued a corrective action plan or a CAP. But it's going to be your big things: not doing drug and alcohol testing when it's required for your CDL drivers, not having annual safety inspections done on your vehicles, using a driver whose CDL has been downgraded, or not having a medical card. Those are all things that will automatically get you issued a corrective action plan.
Okay. And what do you do when you get that corrective action plan as a new entrant? How long are you down and out? You got to shut down operations? What do you do at this point?
That's a great question. So when you get your audit results, if they have issued you a corrective action plan, you have 60 days to respond to the FMCSA. Within those 60 days, if you do not respond and have an approval, it's important to know that just the mere submission is not enough to prevent what's coming down the pipeline. It has to be approved within those 60 days. The FMCSA will place your DOT number out of service until you do provide them with the paperwork that shows you have corrected the violations that they found during your new entrant audit.
Okay. So, all right. So you're not necessarily out unless you screw it up again or fail to respond or something like that.
Or ignore them. They don't like that.
Don't ignore them.
The way I kind of see the new entrant audit is that's really essentially a training tool. They're going to come in, see where your weaknesses are, and if you're weak in some of those areas that fail you, they want to see that corrective action plan that you submit to them showing, here's kind of the mistakes I've made, here's how I've fixed them, and here's how I'm going to make sure they don't happen again. And as long as you submit that in the time and you do it to their standards, you're essentially going to be able to go on as if you passed it initially. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. Yep, exactly. And they call it an audit, but I like to refer to it more as a safety checkpoint. Because like you said, they just want to make sure you have the minimum safety practices in place. If you can provide them with the very basic paperwork that they ask for, they're going to send you on your way.
So we get back to kind of the theme that I sense is going to be part of this particular episode, which is take it seriously, but don't necessarily freak out.
Yes.
Right. So especially for the new entrant audit, you need to take it seriously. You need to jump through all the hoops and all that. But you can look at it as an opportunity for improvement, for learning, for whatever, that baseline. Now, how is it different than when you are not a new entrant? When you've been in operation for a while and you're getting a compliance review and it doesn't go so well. Now what? What's the difference?
So the new entrant audit is always in that first year of active operations. The compliance review can come around from a few different things. We talked previously about, repeat roadside violations leading to being over your intervention thresholds. That's one way that you can get picked for a compliance review. But other ways, if your driver is involved in an accident that has a fatality as a result, the FMCSA will come out to do a compliance review. Those are typically automatically a comprehensive review. They just want to make sure that nothing at the company level contributed to an unsafe driver being on the road. And lastly, if you have a lot of public complaints filed with the FMCSA about your drivers on the road, that can prompt them to come out and do a compliance review. And when things don't go well, you are given a proposed safety rating, either conditional or unsatisfactory. And from there, a lot like with the corrective action plan, you have 60 days to respond or the rating becomes final.
Okay.
Until you submit the right paperwork.
And I was just going to say there has to be some way to ask that be changed, right?
And this is kind of one of the things that's not completely clear to me. So let's say the proposed safety rating is unsatisfactory and you submit everything that you're supposed to and it meets all the FMCSA's requirements, then at that point, their actual rating that they're going to give you would be at very best a conditional, correct?
So if you submit all of the paperwork to address the unsatisfactory rating, then yes, you do just get bumped up to conditional, which allows you to still operate. That's the biggest difference between a conditional and an unsatisfactory rating. If you don't address that within those 60 days, you're immediately put out of service and cannot move your trucks until you submit paperwork. So they'll bump you up to a conditional, which allows you to still operate. But like Chris mentioned, your insurance rates, your loads might not be as great. I have only had one carrier be able to go from an unsatisfactory up to satisfactory. And it's only because they previously had a satisfactory rating.
Okay, so they kind of seesawed back from satisfactory to unsatisfactory, and then fixed whatever it was in short enough order that the auditor said, okay, fine, satisfactory again. But that is not typical.
Correct.
Okay.
Not typical. I've seen it one time.
You've seen it. How many of these have you seen? Ballpark it for me. Hundreds, thousands?
Probably close to 100
Okay.
in the 6 years that I've been with Motor Carrier.
Okay. All right. So typically it'll go, if you jump through all the hoops, it'll go from unsatisfactory to conditional, and then you have to keep proving yourself over the long haul. Dang it. I hate it when I use that term accidentally. But is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And there's different thresholds for the paperwork that they want to see, whether it's unsatisfactory or conditional. You know, if you're addressing an unsatisfactory, they just want to see that you're trying to correct what's going on and what was wrong. But if you're addressing a conditional, they're going to be very strict about the quality of paperwork that you send into them for review. Okay.
All right. So how long does that all typically take? And I'm sure that it's going to be different in case by case. But yeah, give me a ballpark, and when might it take longer or shorter?
Yeah, so the collection phase of the paperwork is typically the longest part. Once you get everything together and it goes into the FMCSA for review, much like those new ENTR audits, it depends on the current workload at the state office. But recently they have allowed us our carriers to start submitting those safety upgrade requests electronically via A&I, the same place you would be uploading your paperwork for the initial review. And we have seen the review time drop tremendously. Before, you would mail a copy to your state office and your service center, and you could be looking at 9 months on average to hear back from them.
So what does improvement mean in this case?
So with the electronic uploads, we've had to go through in less than 2 months.
Oh, wow. Okay.
The fastest one was 15 days.
And those are not typical still, right? It sounds like, okay, a couple of them went in under 2 months, but are we normally talking 3 to 5, 4 to 6 months for this process?
I would say if you submit it electronically, you're going to be looking at a quicker turnaround time, because their idea with that is, say you have 50 that have been sent into Texas and they've only got 5 reviewers, but Utah has 5 that have been sent in. Once they get through what Utah has to review, the idea is that they can help Texas in reviewing those upgrades and kind of cut down the review time for carriers, because they understand that a conditional rating is not ideal. An unsatisfactory rating is less than ideal. And so they're trying to problem solve the long review times, and that's been a solution that they've come up with. So I would say if you can submit it electronically, you're going to get a quick turnaround time.
Okay. And is the information that you're submitting any different than kind of what we talked about previously, or are they asking for new information if you're doing a safety upgrade request?
So when you finish your compliance review, you're issued what's called a Part B, and that will list any of your violations that were found during the compliance review, and you have to address every violation that's listed on the report. So it's going to vary from carrier to carrier how much you have to submit, what paperwork, but a lot of what they're looking for are company policies and procedures that have been reviewed and signed by the drivers to hold them accountable for if these violations continue happening. if you gave the driver a written warning, they would want to see a copy of that. If you've got an issue on hours of service, they're going to want to see log audits and that you're reviewing your driver's information to make sure they are doing what they say they're doing and not going over their hours of service limits.
Okay. Yeah. Sounds good. Now, I want to ask you about some specific instances of, companies that you've worked for, carriers who had to go through all of this and get some stories. But Chris, I think you mentioned that we would be able to take some of the documentation that we've been talking about, redact the important personal info, and let people see some of the letters, some of this documentation that we've been going over.
So they're all in the show notes. There's an example of what that part B that Alex was referring to in the show notes. In the previous episode 162, there's examples of the warning letter, a few of the other things. So you'll be able to see all that in the show notes.
Okay, perfect. So give me some war stories then. So I wanted to get that out of the way just to remind people, or I guess I tell people for the first time, yeah, you can go see some of these things, kind of like in the financials episodes. You can follow along with what Chris and I are talking about. Well, in this case, yeah, go check out some of those documents that we've been going over. So that these war stories make even more sense. So maybe we start with something nicer. Give me an example of somebody who went through this process and it turned out pretty well and went quickly before we get to the scary ones.
Yeah. So one carrier that I worked with fairly recently, within the last 7 months or so, went through the compliance review, had a conditional rating. They had a big problem on driver qualification and hours of service. The most notable thing about this company was they came to us and wanted to change. They wanted to do things right, be proactive instead of reactive, moving forward so they don't run into this problem again. And that, I think, is the biggest personality trait of a company that will be successful at this. You have to want the change. You have to want to do it correctly. There's no magic wand that's going to make it go away.
Alex, are you ever going to run for office? I think you should run for office. Okay. We need to be the change, people. Okay. So what happened with them then?
So they're actually the one that their upgrade went through in 15 days when we submitted it electronically. So the company was just very responsive to all of our feedback, all of our requests for paperwork. If we had inquiries about what happened with a specific driver, so we could, detail what's been done to prevent it from moving forward. They were very forthcoming with the truth about what was going on at the time, why it happened, and what they were willing to do moving forward. And it's just really important to be honest with the FMCSA. You can't say you're going to do things the right way just to get this out of the way and then go right back to your old ways, because they do continue to monitor your safety monthly, even after you submit an upgrade request, to make sure you're actually practicing what you say you're going to do.
So you've submitted the upgrade request. You're up to satisfactory. Oh, great. You breathe a sigh of relief, but that doesn't mean they're not watching.
Yep.
Is what you're saying.
Correct.
Okay. All right. Well, you know what? This isn't as fun a conversation as I was hoping for, because you guys are stressing me out with all these auditors and whatnot. So speaking of which, I'm sure that there have been times when it didn't go so well. Give me an example of that and what happened to that company.
Yeah. So, the flip side, they just expected us to have a magic wand, or anybody in general that would just make it go away. They wanted to say whatever had to be said to make the FMCSA believe that they were ready to make the changes that they needed to. And one place where this always comes out is if we have to do a log audit for a company. We'll do a comprehensive log audit and tell you exactly which drivers are causing a problem, what they're doing incorrectly, so that you can take that back to your drivers and implement the changes that need to happen moving forward. They come back 2 months later with new logs claiming the drivers have fixed everything, and you're just seeing time and time again the exact same violations. Okay.
And so this gets into the attitude thing you were talking about, where It's you don't actually care about the safety of your drivers, your loads, your trucks, your people on the road,
Yeah.
whatever. You don't actually care about that. You just want to collect that sweet revenue, go from point A to point B, and hope everything works out okay.
Yeah.
Right?
You can't make somebody change. So that's where the attitude comes into it. The company itself has to be prepared to do a complete overhaul and change and correct the areas of deficiency. The FMCSA is not there to shut them down. They're just there to make sure that everybody else on the public roadway is safe, and this is the best way for them to do that.
And, at the risk of turning this into a Motor Carrier HQ commercial, which I don't want to do, but Alex, you do work with Motor Carrier HQ, and this is one of the services that you guys provide. Is it the case that if a carrier gets audited and that auditor finds out, oh, they're working with Motor Carrier HQ, these auditors, do they know you guys? Do they know, working with a company like yours, does that have any effect on how smoothly the process goes and how the auditors look at what the carrier is doing?
I think it has a really positive impact, especially on the carrier's overall experience in going through a safety upgrade, because it is a lot of paperwork. It's a lot of legwork. And, if you hire a third-party company to do it, they're going to tell you exactly what the FMCSA is looking for based on those violations. So it takes a lot of the guess and check work out for the carriers. They submit it themselves and wait 9 months to hear back and feel like they're starting all over again.
Right.
Where, with a third party, they're not the only carrier that we've done this for. So we've seen what the FMCSA is looking for, what they want to see. Here in Utah where we're based, the reviewers here do know our company and we work pretty closely with them. I'd like to think that in other states, they would have a positive outlook on paperwork that comes from our company. But I know here in Utah, definitely, yes.
Okay. So yeah, it's like I said, I didn't mean to turn this into a commercial or anything, but it's one more thing to consider that, and Chris, I'm sorry to say it, but Motor Carrier HQ isn't the only company out there, right? And so it is something to consider where a carrier could say, hey, maybe I bring in a third party to help out with some of this stuff. And yeah, it's going to cost me a little bit, but maybe it'll bring that stress down on some of these things that we've been talking about, right?
Yeah, and I would even say, and chances are you're going to get through the process a lot faster. Because you think about it, if a company like ours, if Motor Carrier HQ reviews your logs before they get submitted to the FMCSA, we're going to find issues, help you be able to fix those issues and resubmit things, or really the first time you're actually submitting them to the FMCSA, they're already in much higher quality than they would have been otherwise. Or if you're missing stuff on your driver qualification files, we're going to notice that, get you to fix it, and then it gets submitted. So a lot of the times, by the time we've gone back and forth between us and our client, and then we get kind of what we consider the final package that actually gets submitted to the FMCSA, you're already to a point where we've done this enough that we know things are going to go well.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right. So let's get to one other topic or area that I wanted to talk about, and that's fleet size, because things are different for a carrier. If you're an owner-operator, or if you own 10 trucks, or if you own 1,000 trucks, things work differently, and I have to imagine that ISS scores and audits and all of this, they're going to work differently depending on your fleet size. Am I right?
Yeah, I would say with the ISS score, I mean, that system is designed to compare you to carriers who have a similar fleet size. And so I think that's a little bit a more fair playing ground, because you're not an owner operator being compared against these 1,000 truck fleets. But when it comes to an audit or a safety upgrade, your fleet size can really impact how much work it's going to be. The bigger your fleet, the bigger your sample size. So therefore, more paperwork that you have to provide. If you're just an owner operator, you're the only person you have to submit paperwork for to the FMCSA.
So if you've got a few trucks, let's say 5 or fewer trucks, that's a situation where they're going to ask you for documentation, paperwork on every truck. And if you've got 10,000 trucks out on the road, they're not going to ask you for 10,000 different logs. They're going to ask you for a sample size of, or a sample of a certain size.
Yeah. So the minimum is typically 5. Obviously, if you have less than that, then that just means everybody sends in paperwork. The next step up from there is 13. And then 21 is the largest sample size that I've ever seen.
Do you recall what the size of that fleet was?
I don't off the top of my head, but I've only seen it one time. 13, they had about 55 trucks and drivers.
Okay. So, yeah, somewhere around a third to a quarter of what they had out on the road. Or flip a quarter to a third, whatever. You know what?
Somewhere around there.
Chris,
numbers.
You do numbers. I barely do words, all right? So, all right, good. Let's then kind of zoom out then. We've talked about what happens when you get a letter, what's going to happen in that audit, and hopefully people have learned a ton from that they never have to use, right, Alex? Right. Okay, you probably will. But let's talk about how to stay out of trouble one more time and just talk about best practices, things that carriers should have in place to make sure that they don't run afoul of this whole system.
My biggest recommendation for carriers is to watch those roadside inspections. Make sure that every truck that's listed on those inspections belongs to your fleet. It's not unheard of for people to steal a company name and DOT number and put it on the outside of their truck. They start getting violations, and it's going to impact that specific company, not necessarily that truck. So it will look like a truck that doesn't belong to you is out there ruining your safety score. And that's not fair to you.
I should say.
Okay. And you can dispute those, and if you have to provide a little bit of documentation, but it's not too hard to do. That's another one of the things Motor Carrier HQ can help with. But make sure that if you've got something that, doesn't look like one of your trucks, that you research and dispute it. This is really common with owner operators. A lot of the times when an owner operator quits working for you, they don't take your DOT number off the side of their truck.
They just sell it.
They just kind of keep rolling down the road as if nothing changed. And so when they get inspected, the inspector thinks they're still working for you, and they attribute violations to you. You can dispute those if you can show like determination of the lease and that you took that truck off your insurance on such a day. There's several different things you can do to show that truck wasn't working for me at that time.
Oh, interesting.
And not just with owner operators. I mean, even if you sell a unit, it's really important to make sure that you take your company name and your DOT number off the outside of the truck. Do not trust that the buyer is going to do that. You never know somebody's intentions, so better to be proactive instead of reactive.
Okay. Any other tips, tricks, things, best practices that people should have in place?
Just make sure you have good company policies and procedures in place that establish a minimum for how you expect your drivers to conduct themselves out there in regards to hours of service, vehicle maintenance. Make sure they're doing those pre-trip inspections. Those are the things that are going to save you.
Okay.
I've got a few more that I'd kind of like to cover. So starting with maintenance, make sure you're regularly inspecting your trucks. In our situation, we try to make sure that one of either me, Brad, or Nate look at each one of our trucks once a month. Then, make some of the more common violations that you see on inspections are things that do with tires, like you're not changing out your tires as often as you should, or your brakes, and then audible air leaks. If an air leak is audible, you can get written up for it. So, and those are usually all things that are pretty easy to fix and aren't usually going to catch you off guard. So make sure you've got good maintenance practices. Pull your driver's motor vehicle record and their PSP report annually. And then I think this is a huge one. I talk about it all the time. When you're hiring, make sure you pull the pre-employment screening program PSP report on all your drivers. And if somebody you're looking at hiring shows a history of violations, I wouldn't touch them with a 10-foot pole, because they're going to do the same for you and hurt your company.
Right. Past experience, future results, all that. Okay.
And I just kind of want to end on one thought, and that is that you cannot fake your way to a good safety rating. You've got to have a good program. and you have to try. You don't have to be perfect, but a little bit of effort will get you a long way, and just make sure you're doing a adequate job.
Okay. All right. Any final thoughts, Alex, from you? Anything else that we need to know or that we haven't touched on?
And just reiterate, it's better to be proactive than reactive. Get those company policies in place right now. Make sure you're reviewing driver's logs, pulling those additional reports, unidentified driving, disconnect detail. Don't just look at your hours of service violation report. That would be my biggest recommendation.
Okay. All right. And I guess I'll just end by saying, hey, everybody, don't freak out. Right? That's the theme of this episode. Don't freak out. But only because I said so. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for listening. I'll remind you once again, HaulinAssetsLLC.com. You can go see some of the documentation that we're talking about, so that you will recognize it when it hits your inbox. Hopefully never. Also, you go to motorcarrierhq.com, and you should specifically bug Alex. It just, ruin her day. I want her to get 10,000 emails, okay? And then lastly, HaulinAssetsAcademy.com for the courses that we've mentioned a few times and that I'm sure we'll talk about again. But for now, Chris, Alex, thanks again for coming in, and I will see you guys next time.
Thank you.